Well, there's no way out. Donald Trump has finally been cornered on his tax returns because shall means shall. When people who write laws use the word shall, that means they are leaving no wiggle room. Everyone in Congress knows that. I knew that when I was writing tax law on the staff of the Senate Finance Committee. And that's what the law says about the unique power that the chairman of the congressional tax writing committees have, the power to demand to see any tax returns they want to see. The law says that if the chairman of one of those committees requests a tax return or any information about a tax return, then the Secretary of the Treasury has no choice but to order the IRS to turn over that tax return. Here's what the law actually says. The Secretary shall furnish such committee with any return or return information specified in such request. And so tonight at 6 p.m., Chairman Richard Neal of the House Ways and Means Committee sent this letter demanding 6 years of President Trump's personal tax returns and his business tax returns, and all information about those tax returns in possession of the IRS, including whether any of those tax returns have been audited, something the president has always claimed as his reason for not releasing his tax returns. Chairman Richard Neal and his staff have been working for months on this letter to make sure they were asking for exactly what they need to get a full picture of Donald Trump's tax compliance and to make sure they were following the letter of the law in making this request. Every member of the House Ways and Means Committee knew that at some point this day was coming. And so our next guest, a senior member of the committee, Lloyd Doggett, asked Treasury Secretary about this last month.
Have you received any instruction or guidance of any kind about how to handle congressional requests for President Trump's tax returns?
Based upon the request, we'll examine it and we will follow the law. We will protect the president as we would protect any individual taxpayer under their rights.
Joining us now, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Texas. Congressman Doggett is the senior-most member of the committee who is available for interviews tonight. And Congressman, I want you to look back at your exchange that we just showed with the Treasury Secretary and reflect on what you think his answer means now that Chairman Neal has sent the letter.
Well, Lawrence, thank you. Finally, after 2 years, 6 motions that I made that the Republicans covered up for Trump, and now 3 months into this session, we have the beginning of the beginning. I think what the Treasury Secretary was saying in a bit of double talk, mumbo jumbo, was the emphasis on the word protect. The emphasis should be on the word shall and performing his ministerial duty to provide these returns as required by a near 100-year-old statute with which you're personally very familiar, and you've described it so well tonight. The Secretary, it would appear, and President Trump tonight in his initial comments, he obviously continues to think he's above the law here as everywhere else, and if he chooses to obstruct the Secretary and the IRS from performing their ministerial duty, we need to move forward immediately to seek legal action to get these returns.
Congressman, some reports have referred to the law that controls this as an obscure law, which I guess it is to most members of the news media. But for you, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, any member of the Senate Finance Committee, any member of the staffs of those committees knows that this power exists. They've seen versions of this power used. When I was at the Senate Finance Committee, it was not actually used for any individual the way it is now, any targeted individual, but more for a kind of tax return that the committee was interested in seeing for compliance reasons. How does it work? And so we would sometimes ask the IRS just for tax returns that are taking a certain kind of deduction, and we didn't even have to see the names on them necessarily. But that power has always been there. This is the first time we've seen it used in an aggressive way against a sitting president who is probably very likely to try to resist this in court.
Well, this is a president, of course, with a history of questionable tax activities, a president who deviated from other candidates in refusing to disclose his returns. You've described the statute and the practice and the frequent use of Article 6103 very particularly. I would bring to your attention, I know you're familiar with it, the role that it played with Richard Nixon. The IRS appraised him in their initial public audit, and then when we actually got the returns, my predecessors on the committee and yours on Senate Finance, it turned out the IRS had done a pretty sorry job, and Richard Nixon ended up having to pay almost $500,000 in additional taxes in order to demonstrate that he was not a crook.
And one of the things Chairman Neal pointed out in the informational handout that he gave to the media today, along with the letter, is the fact that the Senate Finance Committee, on confirmations, demands tax returns for for people who get confirmed to positions of the Treasury. It's routine that the committee staff there and the chairman take a look at tax returns for lower-ranking people than the president.
Absolutely. Secretary Mnuchin, other people within the Treasury Department and elsewhere had to produce tax returns. Now, while I differ with the chairman about the scope as to time and the breadth of the returns that are requested, I think he's prepared a very informed request that there's no legal justification in denying this narrow request and producing this 6 years of returns. We've really, after all this time, just reached the beginning of the beginning.
And we all remember Donald Trump saying on the campaign trail that he would release his tax returns, but there was an audit going on. We have no evidence that there was actually an audit going on. Chairman Neal is going to find out whether there was an audit.
Exactly.
It is traditional, as you know, for the president and the vice president to automatically be audited by the IRS. That's a point that Chairman Neal makes in his letter. And one of the things he says he wants to find out is that audit actually happening? Or has, in effect, Donald Trump ordered his own IRS not to audit him?
Well, that's exactly right. We need to know about that audit. We need to know, as with the Nixon case, how well did the IRS do its job. This is all about confidence in our tax system. It's essential Americans have that confidence, and part of that is assuring that the most powerful person in the country is complying with our tax laws. So I think we should at least hold him to the Nixon standard. As you know, earlier this year, we approved the For the People Act here in the House. We want to require this for 10 years and all principal businesses of everyone who runs for president. It's not aimed at any person or any party. It is designed to ensure integrity in our highest office, something that we're really short of under the Trump administration.
And Congressman, talk about what it would mean to turn a tradition, the tradition of voluntary disclosure for presidential candidates and presidents of their tax returns, turn that into a law.
Well, I think it confirms the best practice of candidates of both parties. And all we've had from President Trump, lies and deceit. We have to get the facts. I know he's not a fact-based president or a reality-based president, but on this issue, on the administration of our tax laws, how he has benefited from changes in the tax laws and rulings by his administration, how the IRS is performing its function, those are vital things for the operation of our government, and particularly in the jurisdiction of the Ways and Means Committee.
Congressman Doggett, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I know that you have been pushing this issue of the Trump tax returns longer than anyone else on the committee. You were doing it in that lonely position in the minority while the Republicans were trying to shut you up every time you brought it up.
Indeed.
And this is a very important night. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.